Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana at 5600 Van Road. We would love to have you join us for our 10 a.m. Sunday worship period and also our 4 p.m. in the afternoon if that's a little bit more convenient for you. You can also join us early at 9 for our Bible classes every Sunday morning as well as at 7 p.m. on Wednesday evenings. If you would like to get in touch with us, then feel free to reach out by phone at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org, and we would love to hear from you and get back as soon as we can. The book that we are studying today is Esther. Esther falls in the same rough time period as Ezra and Nehemiah. I suppose she fits right in the middle of the book of Ezra, but before Nehemiah. And in the context of the Israelites, this is during the period of the return from captivity, and yet she is among the captives who have not returned to their homeland. There are quite a few who stayed in Babylon and its surrounding area as the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire. And so it occurs during the reign of the Persian king Ahasuerus. That's what he is called throughout the book of Esther. And if you look at Persian records for an Ahasuerus, you will not find one because, we're taking names and then transporting them into different languages, and it gets a little confusing as to which one refers to whom. This is most likely the Persian king that we know as Xerxes, who reigned from 486 BC to about 465-ish, depending on how you count it. And you know him perhaps from King Leonidas and 300 fame, that's that guy who attacked Greece, and it didn't go as well as he was hoping. In Esther, the topic is nothing that geopolitical and grandiose exactly, but it's not all that obvious from the outset what is the topic. In fact, the purpose of the book of Esther is to establish a new Jewish feast, Purim. And as with all of the Jewish feasts, the name Purim has a meaning, a specific meaning. It translates to lots, not like a great amount of something, but rather the practice of casting lots, to which the modern analogy would be rolling the dice in order to make a decision, except explicitly as a method of divination, or like getting God's answer to some quandary. Sometimes it was used just as a random chance generator, but in the first place, most ancient cultures, and many modern ones for that matter, don't distinguish between getting God's answer and using random chance. And in the second place, while it's very easy to misuse this concept, also, Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. There's an oft-repeated oddity about Esther, which I think is worth noting, that it doesn't actually mention God. At least not directly, and that seems weird for a book of the Bible. There has been some consternation in some circles over this point over the past 2,500 years or so as to whether it belongs in the Bible at all. I think that's unnecessary. The whole story relies on an understanding of God's providence. In fact, we'll come to this later again, but in chapter 4, verse 14, one of the main characters, Mordecai, is speaking to the other main character, Esther, and he says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" You can try to explain this away in some secular fashion, but it really doesn't work. The whole point that Mordecai is making relies on some idea of a transcendent and authoritative will that is going to be done. Whether we call it fate or destiny or God is really of no consequence, because that transcendent will, it's God, whether you like it or not. It just is God. So on the one hand, this book serves to showcase God's providence and his unstoppable plan in rescuing his people. And on the other hand, it also showcases human depravity and debasement, starting what we would consider to be relatively small and then ending what we would consider to be rather huge. Now, within this book, it highlights the recurring human impulse to exterminate the Jews. What's up with that? No other group has been subject to so many and such elaborate and credible attempts to exterminate it as the Jews have. After Germany's attempt in the last century, we say never again and all that, but I mean, look around at the world today and yikes. Let's begin in chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and all the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, and we'll stop there in the middle of a sentence because this book is pretty long-winded. So we've got the wealthy elites assembled for a feast. Fine, that's normal, it sounds very dignified. That's about to change as the sentence continues and in the next few verses. We learn that it's pretty much all about getting slobbering drunk and just reveling in this great opulence and wealth. Let's skip down to verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carkas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So they started by degrading themselves, and now King Ahasuerus is stooping to degrade others, and specifically his own wife and queen. Now, I don't mean to say that Vashti represents the ideals of purity and chastity here. She really doesn't. But her husband is putting her into an impossible position in which she has a duty to guard her modesty for her husband, and yet her husband is also telling her to put herself on display because of her great beauty. Well, she refuses. We can argue about whether she's right or not in doing this. I don't think that that's going to be a very profitable discussion. But regardless, the king is embarrassed greatly by this, for obvious reasons, and his officials are scandalized at it, because they are, rather pathetically, afraid of the ripple effects of what Vashti has done. They're afraid that their own wives are going to hear about it, and they're going to start taking after Vashti's example. And so, verse 19... If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So they form a plan to basically go through the empire and snap up all of the most attractive young girls, and then let the king choose one of them to be the new queen. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Why might Mordecai not want her to share her heritage far and wide? Because the Jews are a despised minority, and so, well, let's just keep that under wraps. Pick up in verse 12. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Usually we pretty much skip this entirely or else read it and move on very quickly, but I want to draw attention here to the... Let's be clear about this. The king first sent his thugs out to requisition the best-looking young teenage girls and bring them to his fortress and then wall them off from society in order to use them for his own sexual gratification. We're not told whether the king's agents phrased this as a request or an offer or as a demand, but usually concubines like this were bought or captured, and so we're left to assume that it's, at best, shall we say, an offer you can't refuse. Now, the women, as we read here, were given all kinds of luxuries and a great deal of security, and so we might even look on them with a slight degree of envy, but when you're a sex slave, I'm not sure that this really balances the books, does it? In the modern West, it's very fashionable to complain about the patriarchy, which is something that I've mentioned on the show before. When people make this complaint, really they're complaining about the Christian sexual ethic, which is basically inherited from the Jews, but both got it from God. Supposedly this patriarchy, meaning really Christianity, is really, really bad for women because it objectifies them and treats them as property for men to enjoy. It strips them of their agency and it prohibits them from experiencing the world or gaining any real power. I present to you the alternative to Christian patriarchy, for whatever that's worth. As a side note, I don't even know why I'm mentioning it, verse 21, in those days as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So first of all, we are introducing a second plot arc here. This is going to be picked up later. Side note, a Persian gallows is a sharpened post, and you impale the person on it, and sometimes you at least have the decency to kill them first, but not always. Second of all, we just sort of skipped over it, but Esther was, in fact, when she had her opportunity to go into the king, chosen to replace Vashti. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So this was another major gear shift and the introduction of another plot in the course of the story. We are introduced to a new main character who really hates Mordecai. So Haman decides to kill all of the Jews because of this perceived insult when Mordecai refuses to bow on account of, I'm a Jew and I will only bow before the Lord my God. He forms a genocidal plan and presents it to his king, and the king hears it and basically just says, okay, whatever, let's do it. That brings us to chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. Well, Mordecai tells Esther about this and asks her to go before the king and plead on behalf of her people. And verse 11, she responds, All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. This is one courageous chick. Side note, what was Vashti's transgression again? The king called and she refused to come. Esther is agreeing to perform the inverse of this, to come before the king without him calling. These are two versions of the same offense, disregarding the importance of the king's call. And Esther's just going to repeat it? Okay, chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." Oh, what a relief! This is often seen as sort of the climax of the story. We're not even halfway through, so let's not get too wrapped up in it. Esther draws out this process. She hasn't been called before the king in 30 days, and so I guess she sees a need to kind of schmooze him a little and remind him of how much he cares about her. And so she draws this process out, invites both him and Haman to a banquet that night, at which she invites both him and Haman to another banquet the next night. And as she strings the king along, she's also stringing Haman along. He is flying high at this point. Not only has he been elevated to a very high position by his king, but he's also dining now with the king and queen. This is a major honor for him. And there's the first time, and there's another one tomorrow. He's got to be thinking, they really like me. Verse 9. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. Well, they put together a plan that amounts to, verse 14, Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. In the course of this reading, he is reminded of that whole plot thing where the gallows first came up, and he realizes that he never rewarded that guy. What was his name? Mordecai, who rescued him. That was like 6 years ago at this point. Well, meanwhile, Haman, emboldened by the dinner invitations, is waiting outside to ask a favor, Mordecai's death warrant. Verse 6, So Haman came in, and the king said to him, What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Perhaps you can see where this is going. Haman proceeds to lay it on thick, assuming that he is basically just giving a wish list for himself that's about to be fulfilled. Verse 10, Then the king said to Haman, Hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. Well, Haman doesn't really have any choice but to comply, does he? This could be laughed off by a normal person who would realize, yeah, I got too big for my britches, and I ended up having to humble myself and do something nice for someone I really didn't like. But this isn't a normal person. This is a narcissistic maniac, and he feels deeply wounded and humiliated by having to do this. And so in this state, we pick up in verse 14, While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, Who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Well, that's awkward. Now put yourself in the king's shoes. What would you do? Now let's see what this guy does. Verse 7. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, Hang him on that! So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. Nearly all of the little subplots have just come together, haven't they? Chapter 8 covers the fallout from all of this because an order has been issued, and the way the Persian laws worked, they couldn't just be changed. He can't rescind the order, but what he can do is issue a follow-up that says, remember how I told you that on such and such a day you could just attack the Jews and kill them and plunder their property with complete impunity? Well, now I'm going to allow the Jews to defend themselves against you with complete impunity, so yeah. And as it turns out, that ends up being enough to rescue the Jews from their enemies, and they end up being the victors in the fight. Chapter 9 accounts for what happens on that appointed day and the great victory of the Jews over all their enemies. And this also serves to inaugurate a new feast, as we mentioned at the beginning, Purim. Why is it called Purim or Lots? Well, because of something we skipped earlier in chapter 3, verse 7. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples of all the provinces of your kingdom. This is when Haman presented his genocidal plan to the king. He had been, for almost a year, casting lots every day, waiting for, I guess, the gods to show him by divine revelation or divination, I guess we could say, that this was the favorable time to accomplish his purpose. So, taking that and reversing it and saying, well, the way it actually worked out, the lot was cast in favor of the Jews, we might say. These chapters 8 and 9 are really the important bits of the book because it's about this establishment of the new feast. But for us, they're pretty boring, so we're not going to read them all. We will read chapter 10, however. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. This serves as sort of an epilogue and happily ever after notice to the story, and I think it's important to note that the story is not about a good Persian king rescuing a beleaguered Jewish girl and later the Jewish nation. Rather, Ahasuerus comes off as a drunken, detached, lecherous fool who constantly defers to others rather than leading as a king ought to do. He fails to live up to his intended role in society. He's got no self-control with regard to alcohol. We saw that in chapter 1. We also saw it in his feasts with Esther. He is humiliated by his wife, and he demonstrates that, as George Costanza put it more than 30 years ago, he has no hand. Not, I hasten to add, that his attempted use of his authority was appropriate. Trotting out his wife to display her beauty before his friends so as to make her a spectacle of sexual desire and that sort of thing, that's not how a husband is supposed to treat his wife. He should rather be guarding her modesty, which is intended for him, and him alone. The king has no self-control with respect to his sexual passions. He resorts to literally emasculating other men in order to use them to guard all of his many women, which are pretty much all to be used once and then discarded, but still kept off the market for the rest of their lives. He wants to corner the market on sexual gratification for himself and himself alone. He treats these women as objects. There's no mention made of the many, many children that would obviously result from these many unions. In fact, in most cases in this culture, those children would be deemed illegitimate. He can't even manage his own slaves very well. He's got a pair of eunuchs who decide that they want to assassinate him, and he has to be rescued by Mordecai from their plot. He doesn't reward his rescuer Mordecai in a timely manner, although he does get around to it later. But how do you forget that for 6 years? He fails to discern good advice from the ravings of a genocidal maniac. He fails to manage his own decrees. He just hands over his signet ring to the first person who has an idea. He's a rubber stamp and little else, at least in regard to this story. He fails to personally protect his supposedly precious queen. When he realizes that such protection is needed, his first reaction is to leave the room. And like I said, that strikes me as odd. Rather than perpetrating the violence that was required himself, which for most husbands would be their first inclination, he delegates it to somebody else. And he ends up in chapter 10 as almost an afterthought from the Jewish perspective, because Mordecai, not to mention Esther, has worked his way into a highly influential position. It works out well for them, and it works out well for the Jewish nation. That leads us to the primary contrast of the book: King Ahasuerus and Mordecai. We could throw in Esther here as well, but Mordecai is really the one calling the shots. Mordecai is conscientious. He is loyal. He is demanding, but fair. He shows great responsibility, even taking on extra burdens when it's appropriate. He is reliable. He is discerning. He bears insults without becoming bitter. He accepts honor graciously. He fears and trusts God. Even though he doesn't shout about it, it's obvious to see. He does not gloat over an enemy's downfall. I'm sure I could go on, but I think that's probably enough. The story is not about good versus evil, with good personified by Mordecai and Esther, and evil personified by Haman, while the king stands in for God in the middle, arbitrating. Instead, it's about the king and his entirely corrupted power structure, which has devolved into a collection of doddering fools influenced by evil. How do the righteous behave in such circumstances? There's a temptation to become bitter and resentful and hateful. There's a temptation to become evil in order to defeat the evil. But that doesn't work. You might defeat that particular brand of evil, but two brands of evil fighting each other, the outcome is always going to be evil. There's a temptation to refuse to fight for fear of A, losing, and B, making a misstep. None of those is good, though. None of those is what Mordecai and Esther did. Rather, the way to handle it is to man up. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is what Mordecai said to Esther, but the principle applies to each and every one of us. Esther was an orphaned teenage girl of an oppressed and despised minority who was rounded up by the government and pressed into, effectively, sex slavery with no consideration given to her will, and then cloistered away in the custody of other slaves to await her turn at the fulfillment of her new life's purpose, gratifying a man she'd never even met, and then remaining a prisoner for life afterward. If she could rise above that and put her trust in God, take the kind of leap of faith required of her, and find such a dignified manner of life that we remember her as a queen rather than a concubine, I think you can probably work with whatever troubles come your way too, and find a way to serve God throughout. He doesn't need your help, but he wants your heart, and he wants to use you to carry out his plans for good. As Paul writes in Romans 8:28, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." If you are ready to answer that call, then stand up and face whatever it is that you fear. It starts with faith in God and his Son, Jesus, who died to redeem you from sin and put you to work in his kingdom. And we'd love to help you to take that leap of faith at River Ridge. You can get in touch with us by phone at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for Sunday morning worship at 10. I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.